There's a story we tell ourselves, isn't there? A grand narrative etched into the very bedrock of our dreams. It's the one about the sudden breakthrough, the brilliant flash of genius, the lucky strike that changes everything in an instant. We're taught to look for the mountain peak, to gaze in awe at its impossible height, but rarely do we trace the meandering path, the countless footfalls, the slow erosion that shaped it over millennia. We glorify the champion hoisting the trophy, but we rarely see the brutal, solitary hours in the gym, the missed parties, the aching muscles, the thousand tiny defeats that forged their resolve. We chase that lightning bolt, that singular, magnificent moment. We wait for the grand slam, for the lottery ticket, for the overnight sensation. We yearn for the quick fix, the easy button, the sudden flood that sweeps away all our troubles. We are conditioned to believe that true success arrives like a sudden, glorious sunrise, painting the world in vibrant hues, rather than the patient, almost imperceptible growth of a seed pushing through stubborn earth. And in that relentless pursuit of the spectacular, we often overlook the profound, quiet power of the mundane. The simple, honest truth is monumental change rarely arrives with a roar. More often it comes with a whisper, a persistent tap, a steady drip. It's the rain that carves canyons, not the sudden storm that just rushes past. It's the tireless, unwavering dedication to 1,000 small somethings that, when finally tallied, add up to an astonishing, undeniable whole. It's the invisible compounding of effort, day after day, that builds not just a life, but an empire out of thin air. Take a man like Garrett. 45 years old, though the decades had stacked heavier on his frame than on the calendar. He wasn't a man you denotice in a crowd, not at first glance. He was built like a truck engine, solid, heavy-duty, made for grinding work. His shoulders, perpetually sloped from years of lifting, pushing, and pulling, seemed to carry an invisible weight beyond the factory floor. His face was a roadmap of the life he'd led. A forehead permanently furrowed, not from worry so much as from concentration, from looking hard at things that needed fixing. Crow's feet fanned out from the corners of his eyes, etched deeper than any laugh lines, hinting at long shifts and maybe, just maybe, a quiet sadness that rarely surfaced. But his hands were the real story. They were knotty, gnarled instruments of labor, the skin toughened to hide 1,000 small scars from stray sparks, sharp edges, and stubborn bolts. The fingernails, kept short and clean, often still bore a faint smudge of grease that seemed impossible to scrub away completely. These weren't hands made for delicate tasks or waving wildly in conversation. These were hands that understood the weight of metal, the vibration of machinery, the specific give of a stripped screw. They were the hands of a man who worked hard, who didn't complain much, who just got on with it. He worked at the Atlas Gears plant, same place for 22 years, give or take. The air in there was a constant symphony of clanking, whirring, and the deep, throbbing hum of machines that never truly slept. Garrett operated the big hydraulic press, turning raw steel into component parts with a practiced, almost artistic precision. Day in, day out, the rhythm was the same. Load the plate, push the button, watch the ram descend with a pneumatic hiss and a dull thud, then unload the shaped piece. Repeat, 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 thousands upon thousands of times. He was reliable, Garrett. The kind of guy you could set your watch to, not just for his arrival at 6:45 a.m. sharp, but for the steady, unflagging pace of his work. Never the fastest, never the flashiest, but always there, always producing. The foremen knew it. The younger guys who tried to keep up with him felt it. Even the machines themselves seemed to hum a little steadier when Garrett was at the controls. He wore simple, faded work clothes, heavy denim jeans, a gray sweatshirt, steel-toed boots scuffed and worn. They were less an outfit and more a second skin, molded to his frame, holding the faint, persistent scent of his workplace. He wasn't much of a talker, Garrett. Not that he was unfriendly, just quiet. He'd nod at a greeting, offer a gruff morning if pressed, but mostly he kept to himself. His eyes, the color of tired gray slate, missed nothing. He saw the new kid fumbling with a wrench, the old-timers trading jokes, the shifting politics of the shop floor. He just processed it all silently, a seasoned observer in his own unchanging world. Beneath the surface, there was a deep-seated ambition he'd almost forgotten, buried under layers of routine and resignation, a quiet hope for his children, Leo and Sophia, that perhaps their lives wouldn't be quite so predictable. But those thoughts were for the dark hours, not the bright, clanging reality of the factory floor. There's a quiet truth that hums beneath the surface of the working world, a rhythm older than any factory whistle. It's the way a mountain wears down, not from a single earthquake, but from countless raindrops over centuries. It's the river carving the canyon, not in one flood, but in an endless, patient trickle. And it's how the biggest things in a man's life, the real victories, aren't built in a single heroic swing of the hammer, but in the relentless, almost invisible tapping, day after steady day. Most men, they spend their lives looking for the grand slam, the lottery ticket, the one big break. They chase the lightning flash, burning bright and quick. But some, the quiet ones, learn to tend the slow, steady burn. They learn to trust the compound interest of effort. They learn that the real gold is found in the dirt, not the sudden gleam. One such man was Garrett. 45 years old, he knew that slow burned better than most, though he didn't quite believe in its power anymore. His life had been a series of alarms, not just the piercing shriek of the clock radio at 5 a.m., but the quiet, internal alarms that never quite got answered. Each morning, before the sun even thought about stretching its rays over the horizon, Garrett's routine began. A grunt, a stretch that popped more than it should, the familiar scent of instant coffee brewing in the chipped mug Maria had given him years ago. He'd stand at the kitchen counter, gazing out the window at the dew-soaked lawn, the tired paint on the old picket fence, watching the streetlights flicker off one by one, signaling the false dawn of another workday. The drive to the factory was a blur of half-eaten toast and local radio news, the same headlines, different dates. He knew every pothole, every turn, the exact timing of every traffic light. Once inside, the roar of machinery was a constant companion, the rhythmic clang and hiss a soundtrack to his life. His station was on the assembly line, fitting the same component to the same machine chassis, hour after hour. Left hand, grab part. Right hand, align, push, click, repeat. Thousands of times a day, 5 days a week for 25 years. His hands, thick and scarred, moved with an unconscious precision, a memory in the muscle that bypassed his brain entirely. He could do it blindfolded, probably. Sometimes he felt like he was. Each paycheck was a tightrope walk. Not a high-wire act, just enough to keep his feet above the muck. Maria was a magician with a budget, stretching every dollar until it screamed for mercy. Groceries, the constant hum of the electricity bill, the water heater that threatened to quit, the leaky faucet in the bathroom, the car that needed new tires, the endless stream of needs from Leo and Sophia. Their modest single-story house in the older working-class neighborhood, a place they'd bought with starry eyes, now felt less like a home and more like a collection of problems waiting to be solved. Each creak, each draft, each faded patch of paint was a silent reminder of what they didn't have and what Garrett felt he wasn't providing. But it wasn't just the bills that kept him up some nights, staring at the ceiling, listening to the gentle snores of Maria beside him. It was the ghosts of what might have been. A younger Garrett, not yet weathered by the relentless grind, had carried a notebook filled with ambitious sketches. Designs for tools, for furniture, for ingenious solutions to everyday problems. He dreamt of building something with his own name on it, something lasting, something that showcased the sharp mind he knew he possessed, not just the strong back. He'd seen himself as a craftsman, a creator, a man who shaped his world, not just a cog in someone else's. Now his hands, once eager to design, were simply tools for hire, fitting other men's visions, piece by monotonous piece. He tried in bursts to reclaim that spark, signed up for an online course in CAD software once, bought a set of woodworking chisels another time, promising himself this was the year. He'd dive in with a feverish intensity, stay up late, feel the old ambition stir. But then after a few days, a week, when the initial excitement wore off and the results weren't immediate, the progress felt agonizingly slow. The heavy blanket of, "What's the point?" would descend. It felt like pushing against a concrete wall, and he'd abandoned the project, leaving the half-finished work to gather dust, another monument to his own perceived failure. The fear wasn't necessarily failing anymore, not in the dramatic sense. It was the quiet, insidious fear of stagnation, of waking up at 65 and realizing he'd just done the same thing every single day without ever really living. That fear gnawed at him, but then he'd look at Leo, at Sophia, their faces still full of untouched potential, and a different, deeper fear would settle in. He didn't want them to inherit his quiet resignation. He wanted them to believe in more. But how could he preach ambition when his own had been buried under decades of deferred dreams? He'd convinced himself success was for others, for the lucky ones who got a head start or a sudden, dramatic leg up. Not for him, not for the slow, consistent grind. That felt like treading water, not swimming towards anything real. He just kept waiting for the big break, the sudden flash of opportunity, because the idea of chipping away day after day, year after year, felt like an eternity with no guarantee of reward. It felt like throwing pebbles at a mountain. and Garrett, for all his quiet strength, had grown weary of throwing pebbles. The crack, when it came, wasn't a sudden, earth-shattering tremor. It was more like a hairline fracture appearing on a familiar, worn-out teacup, something you might overlook at first, until the tea starts seeping through. It happened on a Tuesday evening, the kind of evening where the air outside still held the lingering scent of damp earth and coming rain. But inside, the house was warm, humming with the low thrum of daily life. Garrett had just come in from the garage, wiping grease from his hands with a rag, ready to settle into his worn armchair and pretend to read the paper while Maria watched her soaps. But as he walked past the open garage door, a different sound pulled him up short. Not the usual cheerful clatter of Leo's experiments, but a frustrated sigh, followed by the dull thud of a small wrench hitting a concrete floor. He paused, leaning against the doorframe, a shadow in the fading light. Leo, 15 and all lanky limbs and restless energy, was hunched over his workbench, his face lit by the cold glow of a task light. Before him lay a complex sprawl of wires, circuit boards, and the half-assembled chassis of what was supposed to be his big robotics project for the state competition. For weeks, Leo had been obsessed, poring over diagrams, soldering connections, mumbling about algorithms and servo motors. But now his shoulders were slumped, a defeated curve to his spine. "It's just not working, Dad," Leo muttered, not even looking up, running a hand through his already disheveled hair. "I've been at this for hours, days, it just doesn't make sense. I connect this and that breaks. I fix that and then this goes wrong. It's like I'm not getting anywhere. What's the point? I put in all this work and nothing. Zero. Maybe I should just scrap it. Tell Mr. Henderson I couldn't figure it out." He pushed a small, intricate component across the bench with his thumb, a gesture of pure, exasperated surrender. Garrett watched him, and it was like looking into a distorted mirror. He saw himself in that frustrated hunch, in that thrown-up hand, in the immediate dismissal of effort when instant gratification wasn't delivered. He heard his own past excuses, his old internal monologue spilling from his son's lips. What's the point? I put in all this work and nothing. How many half-finished bookshelves, abandoned garden plots, neglected car repairs sat gathering dust in his own mental inventory, monuments to that exact sentiment. The words were different, the project was different, but the bitter taste of defeat, the quickness to give up when the big break didn't materialize, was startlingly, painfully familiar. A cold knot tightened in Garrett's stomach. This wasn't just about Leo's robot anymore. This was about a pattern, a quiet resignation that had seeped into the very foundations of his own life, and now he was seeing it bloom in his son. He hadn't just accepted it for himself, he had unwittingly passed it on. He hadn't wanted Leo to inherit his quiet resignation, but here it was, in the slumped shoulders, in the defeated tone. He opened his mouth to offer some empty platitude, some pat-on-the-back encouragement, but the words felt hollow before they even formed. He just stood there watching Leo push the delicate wires aside, the gleam in his son's eyes extinguished, replaced by a dull, hopeless glaze. It hit him then with the force of a physical blow. He couldn't ask Leo to believe in consistent effort in the slow grind when he himself hadn't truly believed in it for years. He couldn't tell his son to keep throwing pebbles when he'd convinced himself it was futile. Later that night, the house was silent save for the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the distant sigh of a passing train. Maria was a warm, familiar presence beside him, her breathing slow and even. But Garrett was wide awake, staring at the dimly lit ceiling, his mind a relentless churning turbine. It was 3 a.m., the hour when doubts took on corporeal form, when the world outside shrunk to the four walls of your bedroom, and your life's choices laid themselves bare. Leo's face swam before his eyes, not just frustrated, but utterly defeated. What's the point? The question echoed, not from his son, but from a younger Garrett, a Garrett who had once dreamed of more than just punching a clock, a Garrett who had picked up a guitar, a paintbrush, a stack of blueprints, only to put them down again when the initial spark faded and the real work began. He felt a profound, unsettling shame. He had taught his children how to change a tire, how to fix a leaky faucet, how to read a map. He had taught them the value of honesty, of hard work, of looking people in the eye. But what had he taught them about persistence? About the quiet, unglamorous tenacity that built things, brick by painstaking brick. He had preached ambition, but he had lived a life of giving up when the going got tough, when the grand slam didn't happen on the first swing. He had waited for the big break, for a lightning bolt, for some external force to propel him forward, all the while letting the small, daily opportunities for progress slip through his fingers. The air in the room felt heavy, suffocating. He saw his own life laid out before him. A series of short, intense sprints followed by long, exhausted pauses, like an engine sputtering and stalling. He remembered the feeling of starting something new, that rush of possibility, that naive belief that this time would be different. And then the familiar slump, the slow creep of cynicism, the quiet justification for quitting. It wasn't the right time. The tools weren't good enough. I didn't have the talent. Lies, all of them. Excuses he had told himself to avoid the real work, the consistent work, the work that promised no immediate reward, only the faint hope of a distant, compounding payoff. He thought of the factory floor, the relentless clang and whir, the monotonous repetition. He didn't hate his job, it provided. But it wasn't what he'd dreamed of. Not really. He told himself it was enough, that comfort was enough, that the lack of drama was enough. But lying there in the oppressive silence of 3 a.m., he knew it wasn't. It was a holding pattern, a comfortable cage he had built around himself, piece by piece, day by day, by not daring to chip away at anything larger, anything more challenging. A chill snaked through him despite the warmth of the blankets. He was 45. Half his life, maybe more, was behind him. Was this it? Was this the sum total of Garrett's quiet strength? To be the man who threw pebbles and gave up when they didn't immediately topple the mountain? The idea, raw and brutal, settled over him like a shroud. He felt a desperate urgency, a deep, unsettling fear that wasn't just about his own stagnation anymore, but about the legacy he was leaving behind. He couldn't let Leo inherit this. He simply couldn't. Something had to give. The idea, raw and brutal, settled over him like a shroud. He felt a desperate urgency, a deep, unsettling fear that wasn't just about his own stagnation anymore, but about the legacy he was leaving behind. He couldn't let Leo inherit this. He simply couldn't. Something had to give. That something began to give a few days later, not with a bang, but with a series of small, frustrated sighs drifting from Leo's bedroom. Garrett was in the kitchen, wiping down the already clean counter, a nervous habit of his when the sound started. A soft clatter of plastic, followed by a grunt, then a sharper metallic clink and a more emphatic exhale. Garrett knew that sound. It was the sound of a kid hitting a wall, a particular kind of wall made of stubborn circuits and unyielding code. He walked quietly down the narrow hall, stopping just outside Leo's open door. The room was a controlled chaos of wires, circuit boards, small motors, and what looked like the half-assembled skeleton of a mechanical spider. Leo, his brow furrowed in concentration that had clearly curdled into exasperation, was hunched over a laptop, one hand gripping a small screwdriver so tightly his knuckles were white. The screen glowed with lines of code that Garrett didn't understand, but the expression on Leo's face that he understood perfectly. "Everything all right in here, champ?" Garrett tried for casual, but his voice was a little too tight. Leo didn't look up, just shook his head, a quick, jerky motion. "No." "It's not. This thing's garbage, Dad. Absolute garbage." He pointed a trembling finger at the skeletal robot. "I've been trying to get this arm joint to articulate for 2 hours. 2 hours. I changed the code, I resoldered that connection twice, I even swapped out the servo motor. Nothing. It just twitches, like it's mocking me." His voice cracked on the last word, and he slammed the screwdriver down on the desk, the sharp crack of plastic on wood echoing in the small room. Garrett watched as Leo pushed his chair back with a frustrated screech, his gaze falling on the project, defeated. The shoulders that had been squared with youthful ambition just yesterday slumped inward. Garrett saw the familiar glint of tears in his son's eyes, quickly blinked away, replaced by a mask of sheer, utter weariness. It wasn't just physical exhaustion. It was the fatigue of a spirit about to surrender. He saw the fire that had burned so brightly in Leo's eyes for this robotics competition, a fire that was now flickering, threatening to extinguish completely. And in that moment, seeing Leo stare at his half-finished robot with such profound disillusionment, Garrett saw himself. He saw the dusty remnants of his own abandoned dreams. The half-finished workbench in the garage, tools scattered beside wood that never became what he'd intended. The classic truck he'd bought with grand plans of restoration, now a rust-eaten hulk slowly sinking into the backyard earth. The online welding course he'd signed up for, enthusiastic for 2 weeks, then lost steam, the login details eventually forgotten. He'd always told himself he just didn't have the time, or the money, or the knack. But looking at Leo, at the raw frustration that mirrored his own countless times, he knew the truth. He hadn't been defeated by lack of talent or resources. He'd been defeated by the lack of immediate gratification, by the slow, stubborn refusal of things to bend to his will instantly. He had sought the grand slam, the sudden breakthrough, and when it didn't come, he'd packed up his bat and walked away, convinced the game wasn't for him. He'd never learned how to just keep hitting singles. "It's not garbage, Leo," Garrett said, his voice softer than he intended, a slight tremor in it. He walked further into the room, past the discarded snacks and textbooks, and rested a hand on Leo's slumped shoulder. The kid flinched, then leaned into the warmth of his father's touch, still not looking up. "You're just frustrated. I get it." Leo scoffed, a bitter sound. "Frustrated? Dad, I'm done. I don't care about this stupid robot anymore. I'm just going to tell Mr. Henderson I couldn't finish it. Everyone else's are probably perfect by now anyway." The words hit Garrett like a gut punch. "I'm done." How many times had he said that? How many times had Maria heard him say that, watching his brief enthusiasms flare and die? His son, his smart, ambitious son, was standing at the precipice of the same familiar cliff face. And Garrett, who had walked off that cliff too many times, knew exactly what lay at the bottom: regret and a slow, insidious erosion of self-belief. He pulled his hand from Leo's shoulder, feeling an invisible weight descend onto his own. He wanted to offer some wise, comforting words to tell Leo to keep at it, to just try a little longer. But the words tasted like ash in his mouth. What right did he have to preach persistence when his own life was a graveyard of unfinished projects? How could he tell Leo to keep going when his son had just perfectly articulated Garrett's own most common failure mode? The hypocrisy was suffocating. That night, 3 a.m. came again, an unwelcome, familiar friend. Only this time, the chill wasn't just physical. It was a profound, bone-deep ache of self-recognition. Lying beside Maria, whose even breathing was a stark contrast to the tumultuous storm inside him, Garrett stared at the ceiling, seeing not plaster but a tapestry woven with threads of missed opportunities and surrendered aspirations. His thoughts were no longer abstract fears of stagnation. They were concrete, visceral memories of moments he'd given up. The faint, sweet smell of sawdust from the workbench, now just a vague memory replaced by dust and cobwebs. The gleam of chrome on the old pickup, now just rust-pitted brown. The online course logo, a glowing promise on a screen, now faded into the background of a forgotten inbox. He hadn't been lazy, he'd been impatient. He hadn't lacked effort, he'd lacked consistent effort. He had put in bursts, impressive, intense bursts, like a bonfire that burned bright and hot for a short time, then dwindled to cold embers. He hadn't built a lasting fire, stoked steadily day after day. The brutal honesty hit him with the force of a physical blow. He wasn't afraid of hard work. He'd put in countless hours on the factory floor, a steady, reliable drone. He could lift, he could push, he could endure the grind. But that work, in its very nature, provided immediate, tangible results. A paycheck, a product assembled, a shift completed. The kind of work that built something else, something personal, something from nothing, that required a different kind of patience, a different kind of faith. It required believing in a harvest that wouldn't come for months, maybe years, despite planting seeds every single day. He had always wanted the fruit without tending the tree. The truth felt like a raw wound, exposed and bleeding in the darkness. He had convinced himself that success, real success, the kind that built something from the ground up, was for others. For the brilliant, the lucky, the ones who got that big break. He had dismissed the quiet, relentless hum of consistent effort as too slow, too boring, too unglamorous. He had looked for the magic bullet, the secret shortcut, the sudden stroke of genius. And because he hadn't found it, he had convinced himself that the fault lay with the mountain, not with his sporadic attempts at chipping away at it. But seeing Leo's dejection, the reflection of his own past failures staring back at him through his son's defeated eyes, had shifted something deep inside Garrett. It wasn't just his own future he was jeopardizing anymore. It was Leo's. He couldn't teach his son to be persistent if he himself had never truly embodied it. He couldn't tell Leo to believe in the slow, compounding power of daily effort if he hadn't experienced it himself, hadn't lived it. He had to be the example, not for the world, not for recognition, but for Leo, for Sophia, for Maria, for the man he still, buried deep beneath years of resignation, wanted to be. The quiet resolve hardened within him, a stubborn, unyielding knot in his gut. The fear of stagnation, the worry for his children, the quiet desperation for a life more fully lived, it all coalesced into a single, undeniable truth. He had to change. Not just talk about it, not just start with another grand burst of enthusiasm, but truly, fundamentally change his approach. He didn't know what he would do or how he would do it, but the suffocating weight of his own pattern of abandonment was suddenly heavier than any fear of failure. He simply couldn't endure another sunrise knowing he was the same man, making the same quiet excuses, letting the same dreams wither on the vine. This holding pattern, this comfortable cage, it had to go. The factory whistle wouldn't blow for another 3 hours, but Garrett was wide awake. He lay there, the familiar ache in his lower back a constant companion, staring at the faded water stain on the ceiling that looked vaguely like a map of nowhere. The quiet resolve from earlier had solidified into something heavier, something almost painful in its unwavering certainty. He felt like he'd been walking downhill for years, slowly, imperceptibly picking up speed, and now he was finally at the edge of a cliff. He couldn't go back up the slope, and he couldn't stay suspended. Something had to give. It wasn't a whisper of, "Enough!" anymore. It was a guttural, silent roar from the deepest parts of him. He thought of Leo's project, abandoned and gathering dust, a mirror of every half-finished dream he'd ever started with a burst of fire and then let fizzle out into cold ash. The leaky faucet he swore he'd fix, the old pickup truck he'd meant to restore, the evening classes he'd considered to learn welding beyond the factory floor. They all floated through his mind, ghosts of good intentions, each one a testament to his own pattern. Intense effort, no immediate payoff, then the slow, inevitable slide into defeat. He'd always told himself it was just how things were. Life, work, bills, you put your head down, you pushed, and if it didn't work out, well, that's just how the cookie crumbled. But the truth, raw and unforgiving, was that he hadn't truly pushed, not consistently. He'd thrown punches, sure, but he'd never kept jabbing, never worn the opponent down. He'd always waited for the knockout blow, the grand slam, the sudden stroke of luck. And in waiting, he'd done nothing but wait. The first gray light of dawn began to seep through the window blinds, painting faint stripes across the bedroom wall. Maria stirred beside him, a soft sigh escaping her lips. He watched her, her face peaceful in sleep, and thought of the invisible barriers between them, the unspoken parts of her world he only glimpsed. Her family, her memories, all woven into a language he only partially understood. Spanish. He knew enough to get by, enough to order food, enough for pleasantries with her abuela. But Maria sometimes slipped into it with the kids, a rapid-fire comfort that he was outside of, a silent observer. It wasn't a problem, never had been, just a gap. A gap he'd always considered too wide to bridge, too much effort for too little reward. But then the thought settled. Not for a reward, not for fluency, just for the act, for the single, for the small, almost meaningless chip at a mountain. It felt absurd, almost insulting to the monumental weight of his decision just hours earlier. To change his life, to break a lifetime of patterns, and the first idea that surfaced was a language app. He could practically hear his own cynical voice snickering in his ear. What's next, Garrett? Learning to juggle. Peeled himself out of bed, the joints in his knees protesting, and shuffled into the kitchen. The coffee maker hissed its morning song. He pulled out his phone, the worn plastic worm in his hand, and hesitated. His finger hovered over the App Store icon. This wasn't some grand project. It wasn't fixing the roof or starting a business. It was 15 minutes a day, 15 measly minutes. He'd probably learn 3 words in a week. Pointless, the voice inside him growled. You'll quit by day 3. But he remembered Leo's slumped shoulders. He remembered Maria's quiet strength. And he remembered the suffocating cage. He took a deep breath, that acrid tang of burnt coffee filling his lungs, and typed Spanish Learning App into the search bar. He settled on a brightly colored app, downloaded it. 15 minutes. He opened it, stumbled through the introductory phrases. Hola, adios, gracias. He felt ridiculous, a grown man with hands calloused from rebar and welding slag, muttering, "Hello," to a glowing screen like a child. Maria walked in, sleepy-eyed, on her way to the bathroom. He instinctively tried to hide the phone, felt a flush creep up his neck. This was foolish. He closed the app, put the phone down, and let the bitterness of the coffee wash over him. But he'd done it. 15 minutes. A single. Pointless, maybe, but a single nonetheless. Day 2 wasn't much better. He found himself almost dreading the alarm, knowing what came next. The same stiff fingers fumbling with new words. Agua, pan leche. He felt no spark, no aha moment, just the dull ache of obligation. The old voice, the one that celebrated grand gestures and sneered at small increments, whispered, "See, told you, what a waste of time." He slammed the phone down a little harder than necessary, the plastic protesting, and went to work, the taste of defeat already familiar. By day 3, the mental resistance was a solid wall. The 5 a.m. alarm screamed like a banshee. His body felt heavier, his mind fuzzier. He stared at the ceiling, picturing the endless belt of metal on the factory floor, the same faces, the same arguments over shift changes. He felt an overwhelming urge to just roll over, to let the alarm fade into the background, to skip the pathetic 15 minutes. What difference would it make? He'd forget those 3 new words by lunch anyway. He could feel the familiar pull of stagnation, a comfort in its very predictability. His stomach churned with a mixture of self-pity and resentment. This wasn't change. This was torture. Then he remembered Leo's face, etched with that same desperate frustration, poised to give up. He remembered the brief, almost imperceptible tremor in Maria's hand when she counted out the utility money. Suffocating cage. The words were a taste in his mouth. He wouldn't do it for himself, not yet. He'd do it for the quiet hope he held for them, a hope he'd almost let wither. With a groan that vibrated through his ribs, he swung his legs out of bed. His knees cracked like dry twigs. Sat there staring at the phone, willing himself to pick it up. He did. 15 minutes. He hated every second of it. Day 7 arrived like a punch to the gut. It was a Saturday. He usually spent Saturday mornings nursing a second cup of coffee, reading the local paper, letting the quiet settle before the bustle of the kids began. This morning, he woke up late, the alarm having been turned off out of habit. He felt a surge of relief, almost giddy. He'd missed it. He was free. He could stop this ridiculous charade. He poured himself an extra-large mug, slumped into his worn armchair. The paper lay unfolded on the floor. He picked it up, but his eyes kept drifting to the phone, lying innocent on the kitchen counter. The silence of the house felt different now. No longer peaceful, but accusing. He felt a prickle of shame, sharp and unexpected. He'd missed it. He'd chosen to miss it. The voice was back, louder now, smug. See. Knew you couldn't stick with it. Just like everything else. You're a quitter, Garrett. Always have been. He pictured the rusty patch on the roof he'd meant to fix last summer. The broken kitchen drawer handle. The half-finished birdhouse for Sophia, a lifetime of abandoned projects, monuments to his own sporadic, intense effort followed by predictable burnout. A sudden, sharp anger flared within him. Not at the app, not at Maria or Leo, but at himself. At the comfortable rut he dug, at the weakness that was so easy to surrender to. His jaw tightened. He wasn't a quitter, not anymore. He didn't know what he was, not exactly, but he wasn't going to let that cynical voice win this round. He slammed the newspaper down, making the coffee slosh. He picked up the phone. The app icon stared back at him, accusing. He opened it. This time, he didn't even bother to look at the clock. He just started. He made himself do 20 minutes, punishing himself for the lapse, then felt a strange, quiet satisfaction in the exhaustion that followed. He'd stumbled, but he hadn't fallen. He'd gotten back up. By day 14, the initial rush of anger had faded, replaced by something less fiery, more persistent. It was still a grind. His brain still felt like a rusted gear trying to turn. Some days he'd repeat the same words 5 times, each time feeling dumber than the last. The app's cheerful ding felt sarcastic. He wasn't fluent, wasn't having breakthroughs. He still stumbled over "Buenos dias." When Maria came into the kitchen, his tongue suddenly thick. He didn't feel any closer to understanding her rapid-fire Spanish with abuela. He just felt tired, but different tired. A deep-seated weariness that came not from giving up, but from showing up. Every single damn day. He saw the tiny, almost imperceptible shift first in his hands. They still gripped the phone awkwardly, but there was a new muscle memory forming. He wasn't hiding it as much. Then in his head, a new word, casa, would flash unbidden in his mind as he drove past the modest, slightly run-down houses of his neighborhood. He still felt ridiculous, but less so. The battle wasn't won. It was a daily skirmish, but he was showing up for it. And in the simple, brutal act of showing up day after day, regardless of how he felt, there was a nascent strength, a stubborn resolve he hadn't known he still possessed. He was just hitting singles, not even sure if they were counting, but he was hitting them all the same. Day 20 hit Garrett like a punch to the gut. It wasn't just the factory floor that day. It felt like the whole damn world was leaning on him. The conveyor belt jammed twice. A new guy almost lost a finger. And the foreman, a younger fella who probably thought Garrett was a permanent fixture in the building's foundation, just kept barking orders like a frustrated drill sergeant. By the time he punched out, his shoulders ached, his feet throbbed, and his mind felt like a sieve. He drove home in silence, the radio off, just the rumble of the old engine and the whine of the tires on the worn asphalt. His modest house looked even smaller tonight, a tired sentinel against the encroaching twilight. Inside, Maria was already cooking, the scent of garlic and sofrito a familiar comfort that usually mellowed him. Not tonight. Tonight, it just felt like another demand on senses already overloaded. He saw the phone on the kitchen counter, an unassuming black rectangle, and felt a wave of pure, unadulterated dread. 15 minutes. Just 15 minutes. It was nothing, a blink. But tonight, 15 minutes felt like climbing Everest in flip-flops. His finger hovered over the app icon, muscle memory kicking in, but his brain screamed, no, not tonight. You've earned a break. Just skip one. One day won't kill you. The thought was a venomous whisper, tempting him. He could just sit down, eat Maria's cooking, maybe watch some mindless TV. Nobody would know. Nobody would care. He wouldn't be letting anyone down, just himself. And frankly, himself had taken enough of a beating today. He pulled out a chair at the kitchen table, the plastic protesting with a groan. Leo was at the other end, hunched over his robotics project, a tangle of wires and circuit boards looking exactly as Garrett used to look when he hit a wall. Frustrated, defeated, on the verge of giving up. Leo looked up, rubbed his eyes. This thing's a piece of junk, Dad. I've been trying to get this sensor to work for 3 days. It's just not doing it. He slammed a tiny screwdriver down. I'm done. I don't care anymore. Garrett watched him, the words echoing in his own head. I'm done. I don't care anymore. That was him, 25 years ago, abandoning the auto mechanic course, letting go of the dream of his own shop. That was him, quitting the night classes for accounting, telling himself he wasn't smart enough. That was him every time he started something, and then when the immediate results didn't show, convinced himself it was pointless. He looked back at the phone. His hand trembled slightly as he picked it up. His thumb hesitated over the icon again. This wasn't about Maria. This wasn't about Abuela. This wasn't even about speaking Spanish anymore, not really. This was about Leo. This was about the quiet promise he'd made to himself, sitting alone in the dark a few weeks ago, to actually see something through, to be different, to prove to himself and maybe, just maybe, to Leo that showing up, even when it felt futile, meant something. He didn't say anything. He just opened the app. The familiar, cheerful ding grated on his nerves. He felt a deep sigh escape him, like deflating a tire. He started the lesson, the words on the screen blurring for a second. Repetir, aprender, continuar, repeat, learn, continue. He stumbled through the verbs, his tongue heavy, his concentration shot. He got 3 wrong in a row. He wanted to throw the phone across the room. He felt a hot flush of shame, of failure, but then he didn't. He took a breath, pressed the try again button, and forced his eyes back to the screen. He was just hitting singles. Some of them were foul tips, some were barely grounders, but he was swinging. He was still in the goddamn batter's box. Maria glanced over from the stove, a small, unreadable expression on her face as she saw him, head down, brow furrowed, mumbling Spanish words under his breath. She didn't ask, didn't comment. She just turned back to her cooking, the sizzle of the pan filling the silence. But Garrett felt her eyes, felt the silent acknowledgement, a tiny, almost imperceptible shift in the atmosphere. He still felt like an idiot. But he was an idiot who was showing up. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. That felt like everything. Garrett continued the nightly ritual, the cheerful ding of the app now less of an irritant, more of a persistent companion as days accumulated into a week, then 2. His Spanish wasn't fluent, not by a long shot. He still stumbled through verbs and butchered pronunciations, but the hot flush of shame had cooled to a manageable simmer. He was an idiot maybe, but he was an idiot who was slowly, painstakingly learning how to say mesa and agua and por favor. The vocabulary, like mud drying on a boot, slowly, stubbornly started to stick. Simple phrases became less foreign on his tongue, and sometimes, without even realizing it, he'd find himself thinking them as he moved through the noisy rhythm of his day at the factory. About 3 weeks in, a subtle but significant shift occurred. One morning, Maria was at the stove, the scent of coffee and frying bacon filling the small kitchen. Leo was hunched over his robotics project, a snarl of wires and microchips, looking increasingly defeated, his young face furrowed with frustration. "Papa, this motor just won't calibrate," he mumbled, pushing a weary hand through his hair. Garrett, pausing from his own quiet breakfast, found words coming out without conscious effort, almost as if someone else was speaking. "Check the voltage regulator, Hijo. Sometimes they act up with a fluctuating power source, especially with older components." Maria nearly dropped her mug, turning to look at Garrett with wide, surprised eyes. Garrett wasn't an electrician, not really, but years of troubleshooting ancient machinery at the factory had given him an intuitive sense for systems. Leo, equally surprised, but with a palpable flicker of renewed hope, muttered a quick, "Thanks, Papa," and bent back to his work with a new angle of attack. It was a small thing, a throwaway comment, but it was the first time in a long time Garrett had offered unsolicited advice, especially advice untainted by his usual weary cynicism. It felt good, different. That night after his Spanish lesson, Maria finally broke her silence. She was drying dishes, her back to him. "You're doing good with that, aren't you?" she asked, her voice soft, almost hesitant as he put his phone down. Garrett grunted, a habit ingrained deeper than bone, but then surprised himself and her. "It's not as impossible as I thought," he admitted, looking at his calloused hands. "Just gotta keep at it." A faint, genuine smile touched Maria's lips. She didn't turn around, but Garrett felt the warmth of her acknowledgement, a tiny, almost imperceptible nod to his effort. It wasn't a celebration, just a quiet, shared moment. But it felt like a spotlight had hit a hidden, dusty corner of his soul, illuminating something he'd forgotten was there. Hope, quiet, persistent hope. Weeks bled into months, each day a small, almost invisible deposit in the bank of effort. Garrett's Spanish wasn't perfect, but it was functional. He could hold simple conversations, ask directions, understand a good chunk of the news broadcast from Mexico that Maria sometimes watched. He'd even started listening to a Spanish radio station on his commute, picking out words, connecting sounds, the unfamiliar cadence slowly becoming familiar. His Spanish wasn't just a new skill, it was a new lens. He started seeing things differently, the way those small, daily lessons had slowly, imperceptibly built into something solid. It wasn't just in words. It was in the way he approached the broken latch on the back gate or the stubbornly clogged drain. Instead of a furious, all-out assault that usually ended in a bigger mess, he'd take a moment, consider the smallest, gentlest possible intervention, and then another and another. More often than not, the problem yielded. Then came the night Leo, his 15-year-old, slammed his robotics project onto the kitchen table, a tangled mess of wires and plastic, his face a storm of frustration. "It's impossible, Dad. I've tried everything. Nothing works. I'm just gonna tell Mr. Henderson I quit." Garrett looked at the project, then at his son's defeated posture and saw a reflection of himself from years past. The raw, hot frustration of not seeing immediate results, the desire to throw in the towel after a burst of intense, unproductive effort. He remembered the grand plans he'd started, the backyard deck, the car engine rebuild, all abandoned, half-finished monuments to his own short-sighted impatience. He remembered the feeling of failure, not just of the project, but of himself. Instead of his usual gruff, "Figure it out," or "You didn't try hard enough," Garrett pulled out a chair. He didn't offer to fix it, didn't even touch the robot. He just looked at the wiring diagram spread out on the table. "Show me," he said, his voice softer than Leo expected. "Show me the very first connection you made." Leo, surprised, mumbled and pointed to a small green wire. "Okay, is that connection right? Just that one. Don't worry about the whole thing. Is that one secure? Is it going to the right place?" They spent an hour not on the whole complex robot, but on isolating each individual connection, just one, then the next one. It was painstaking, slow, agonizingly boring for Leo at first. Garrett would nod, sometimes just grunt or ask, "What's the next single step?" He watched his son's shoulders slowly relax, the initial fury replaced by a focused, if still slightly exasperated, concentration. By the end of the night, only a quarter of the connections were checked, but they were right. The next evening and the one after that, Garrett was there, a silent, patient anchor. He wasn't solving the problem, he was teaching the process. He saw Leo's confidence slowly, steadily rebuild, not in big leaps, but in tiny, almost invisible increments. A switch clicked, a light flickered, a small motor whirred. Each success, no matter how small, was acknowledged with a quiet nod from Garrett. Finally, on a Friday night, the robot lurched forward, performing its programmed sequence with a triumphant, if slightly wobbly, precision. Leo let out a whoop, grinning from ear to ear, his frustration completely forgotten. He looked at his dad, a flicker of genuine respect in his eyes. "We did it, Dad," he said, not, "I did it." Garrett just smiled, a real, unforced smile. He looked at the robot, then at his calloused hands, remembering the countless Spanish words he'd stumbled through, the tiny victories of understanding a new phrase. He thought about the small, almost insignificant improvements he'd started making at the factory, a 5-minute check on the temperamental press before his shift, a new organization system for his tools that saved him seconds every hour. None of them felt like much on their own. But when he looked back, he saw a path. Later, sitting on the porch swing with Maria, the evening air cool on his face, he sighed contentedly. "You know," he said, looking out at the fading light, "I used to think you had to hit a grand slam, you know, one big heroic swing that sends the ball over the fence. That's what I always waited for, what I always tried to do. And then when it didn't happen, I just gave up." He paused, listening to the crickets. "Turns out," he continued, a quiet wisdom in his voice, "you just gotta keep hitting singles day in, day out. Don't even notice it adding up, not really. You just see the next pitch, focus on making contact. And then one day you look back and you realize you haven't just gotten on base. You've built a whole damn stadium, brick by brick, pitch by pitch. Maria reached over and took his hand, her fingers interlacing with his. She said nothing, but her grip was firm, understanding. And that's the way it often goes. The loudest stories are usually about the overnight sensations, the lucky breaks, the lightning strike. But the real stories, the ones that last, the ones that build something that stands the test of time, those are the quiet ones. The stories about the man who showed up day after day and just kept hitting singles. Because the truth is, you never know what kind of stadium you're building until you stop, turn